Perfect. So immutable builds. What do we mean by immutable builds? We're not. We're going to try and approach this from a little fun way. So this everyone knows this iconic moment with Elon Musk and how they on stage tried to demonstrate some feature of the bulletproofness or the strength of the glass, and it went completely wrong. What does this have to do with mutable builds? We will be coming back to it here shortly. But how did we get here in the first place? I don't know for some of you, but for me, for instance, I remember being a kid, because I probably wasn't the smartest person in the class, and probably sat next to the smartest person. And I'd often copy or try to copy their work, hoping to get the best grades. For some of us, not all of us. If you were the smart person in the class that had this problem, I am sorry. But somehow, sometimes, I was never always getting it right. The person sitting next to me ended up getting an A+, and I still somehow got an F. So it wasn't as easy to copy even from across sitting next to the same, doing the same assignment sitting next to someone. And that's one of the issues we have when we are trying to move development from out as a developer, work for application built on our machine to a different environment where it's like it works on my machine, but once you push it out to the next environment, it's not working. And it's something that happens so frequently, it's become almost like a meme. It's like, but it worked on my machine. You can't possibly think, oh, what could have gone wrong, right? And the idea is you literally just copy the exact same code you just had on your machine to this other environment. So what could have gone wrong? There's several different factors and different things that could have caused this, but immutable builds is I guess a solution towards or immutable infrastructure in general. The infrastructure is immutable, then it enforces you to have an immutable architecture. And that infrastructure in general allows you to kind of have some consistency in terms of the environment and the development block that you're working with, so that you don't end up with like having to test on stage on your production environment and have your screens break. So one quick aside, let me just try to express immutable in the best way I can. Unchanging over time or unable to be changed in general. So when you think of anything that you can say, this is for sure, this is going to be consistent over time, no matter what. My wife, my fiance, whatever the blurred lines is today, tells me diamonds are immutable to some extent. They would never change in time. That's the one thing that would never change in time. I don't know how I feel about that, but I know Game of Thrones ending is not going to change no matter how many people wish for that to be different. But that kind of gives you an idea of what I mean by immutable. When you're talking about your programming language, your code or your application, that immutable state, that state that you know no changes are coming in, no one else is going to push any new commit, that final commit is that immutable block we're looking at, that you know for sure, no matter what environment it's going through, it's not going to change. And the question is, how do we achieve stuff like that? Now, and I'm approaching this from a practical point of view or a different life experience. I'm drawing in from my different life experiences and then trying to approach my understanding of this, and hopefully it helps some people understand it a little better. So imagine imagine you live out in California. You have this home it's slightly small, which is kind of perfectly fit for California, where you have your living room, you have your kitchen, and you can see in the third picture on the right, you can see across from your kitchen to your living room, and then all of a sudden you are this is you in your adolescence years, teenage years. Now you're done with college. Now you've got your first job, and it's in Texas. Now you love the way this home is because you built it with your dad, and you want to keep everything about it. And moving to Texas, it's not going to be fairly easy to you're okay with replicating it, but it wouldn't be fairly easy to get every single part like you have in this home. So you wished you had an idea and you're like, what if I can literally just move this home across to Texas? And that's kind of like the concept and idea we're talking about when we're talking about immutable build and immutable infrastructure. So this imagery right here is a container home. So imagine in a container home, you have your entire home set up already. And you can literally pick your home, put it up on a trailer, right? You can pick your home from California, which is the dev environment, where until things get real, you don't move out to Texas. You put it in there and you put it on the trailer. And in terms of software, you utilize Docker. And now Docker or any other option available to you, but I chose Docker because it kind of just fits in terms of the imagery of what I'm talking about. So you then ship it across the pond, your container across the pond with Docker to your prod environment, right? And now look at Texas, beautiful lush green grass, and you've set up your same old container home, and everything presumably within the container should work or should be the same, right? That's the idea when we're talking about the immutable infrastructure. Now, there are some things that you would need. There's one key thing you need when you're trying to approach this, because your question is, okay, now I have moved this across from California to Texas, but obviously while you were out in California, for instance, you had power connected to your container home. So you had your lights on, you had water plumbing connected to your container home. So you had all that stuff set up. How would that work? How do I guarantee I have that same exact configuration and setup when I move to Texas? Now, one way to approach this is the idea of thinking of the configurations, the settings that would allow for the home to function and run the same way to be externalized from the container home. So essentially be on the outside. So if you wanted to do your power configuration, you have everything configured in the inside and just will have one connection on the outside where it's like, okay, I'm connecting to power, put in your main your grid line in there and you got your power, or your plumbing, for instance. You have the same with the sewage system if there is where you're moving, and you connected from the external side. So if you're thinking of external configuration in terms of your application, that will look like an external database, file system, or environmental variables. For instance, it can be a text file, it can be a JSON file, it can be anything that essentially sits outside of your code block. So when I say outside of your code block, you can typically have your configurations wide into your build, whereas to when you build your final file, depending on the environment you are, if it's a WAR file, if it's if depending on the environment you are in, your build files essentially, you have to have those configurations sit outside such that your application references some environment configuration that sits outside those that build, such that you can switch out the environment configurations at any given time with ease and without having to change anything in terms of that build. So in this sense, if we wanted to switch anything within the home, we do it externally and nothing within the home is affected because all the configuration is outside the home. And that's the same way you would think of it in terms of your code block. Now, that seems pretty straightforward and simple because I try to approach it from a high level without trying to go specifically to, like, if you're looking at maybe Java, how do you externalize it specifically? Or if you're looking at Angular, how do you externalize it specifically? But the main key thing in terms of approaching an immutable build is externalizing the configuration outside of the build, and such that once you run that build, you do not have to touch it, and you can move it across that image, that build image, with Docker, for instance, across the different environments. Any particular questions or discussions that anyone would want to entertain right now? Hello, can you hear me? Or you truly took that no questions seriously?
Here, I am in. Lanny says, hello, Adam Keela, I want to learn to code. So I guess maybe Cyprian, to that point, do you have any advice for Lanny on what they should do? And also um, keep in mind that there is a fantastic coding boot camp that is a sponsor of this entire track. And so I will link them in the channel.
So the same way I'd approach the explanation for immutable build, I'll try to use real world examples for learn how to code. It's almost like saying I want to learn how to speak. So when you start there, the first thing would be what language do you want to start with, or which is closest to you. So there's several different things in terms of programming languages and several different principles and concepts. Right now, object-oriented seems to be the favored one, but there's the functional approach depending on which environment you are in. But if you want to build websites, for instance, then you get more specific in terms of what do I learn, and then you need to just start with the fundamentals. I think at the just like languages, if you don't start with your vowels and your enunciations of two syllables and stuff like that, you cannot progress to the point of making full correct grammar sentences. And so you just need to start with the basics. So if it's a website you're trying to build, you need to start with just pure HTML and then slowly get into CSS before you complicate it with maybe JavaScript or TypeScript, or so you just need to start with the basics.
Perfect. Rodney Thomas, I see you're on the moderation panel. Did you have a question? Oh, here we go. There's another question for you. Lauren's got a question for you, Ed.
So yes, there are so many different tools available for container services and automated service scaling, cloud-based services. Where do you begin to understand what tool will best? Honestly, there are several, and for the most part, the main ones are comparable in terms of what they provide for you. It really depends on your organizational infrastructure and what is available to them. And to some point nowadays, pretty much everything is supported. That whole inter support is available. So for the most part, in terms of the major players, it doesn't matter. It's a question of what are you more comfortable with, what are you already familiar with, and what is your organization currently using, because they are fairly similar in terms of whatever they offer.
Great question. And so I guess, Cyprian, a lot of these individuals are either in the startup phase or looking to be a part of startups, start their own startups. What part of the process should they be thinking about creating these immutable builds?
Well, we'll say that again. What part of process should they be thinking?
What part of the process is that, like during the ideation part, after ideation, once they've got their MVP?
So I think immutable builds come to be important when you're trying to achieve enterprise applications, when you're trying to do things that would stand the test of time and would be fairly easy in terms of, you don't want, when you try and build enterprise application, you don't want to have issues of it works in one environment and not works in the other environment, because more than likely you have a lot of dollar value associated to it not working at any given time. So you want to have some consistency across that. The infrastructure that it takes to set up an immutable infrastructure is a lot of work, and it can also be a lot of cost in terms of having all those different environments. Ideally, you don't need that until you are literally maybe at the MVP stage, where you actually have users that are actively using the application, because the only real core difference in terms of the application that you need to do to make it ready for an immutable environment is externalizing the configuration. You can do that immediately, but you don't have to necessarily have done that in an immutable infrastructure. The immutable infrastructure can come in way later. So that core feature of externalizing the configuration, that doesn't take much effort. But to build an entire infrastructure, it can take a lot of effort, and it would probably slow the progress of your team if it's a startup and you're trying to push one MVP, because usually there's time crunch, and whoever gets out first with MVP is probably the one who's going to be ahead. So usually I would say after that is probably when you should focus on that.
Okay, fantastic. I think there's another question that was up here. SC, what's the best way to find a tech co-founder? I know they've asked that in other chat groups, but I'm guessing they want to get different people's perspectives on it.
What is the best way to find a tech co-founder? Honestly, any insight anyone would give you on this, they would just be connecting the dots backwards based on their experiences. And if you look through in general, people have a variety of experiences, and they seem to all have worked out. I think at the end of the day is if you and the person have a shared vision and have a working relationship that fits in terms of you have the work culture that you are thinking of would be similar to that of your co-founder. I think that's the best first place to look at, because the question again is where's the best place to find a tech co-founder? There is no such thing. Some people find it in school, some people find it out in the bar, some people find it out during hackathons. They're everywhere. At this point in time, everyone is pretty much, entrepreneurship is ripe right now. A lot of people are looking to start something at any given time. It's just about having the right synergy between the two of you, and then having a similar shared vision, and then that makes things a lot easier down the line. Because my experiences may not be necessarily your experiences, and so I can't necessarily rule out that for you.
Perfect. Other questions? If you're listening in, we've got an expert here, willing, eager to answer anything that you do ask. It doesn't necessarily have to be related to immutable builds. You can ask him about his journey to where he, how he got to where he got. You can ask him.
I took a plane.
You can ask him about the weather in Ghana right now, seeing as he is in Ghana right now. Interesting. Good question.
What question? I'm not seeing the questions.
You're not seeing any questions?
Oh, I see
you
it
have
now.
to scroll. Yeah, you have to scroll.
How do you typically manage development teams? So I have experience working with development teams that are distributed, and that's where I found most of my challenge. But on the core, before I get into the distributed team challenge, I typically manage teams from a perspective of micromanagement, like not directly getting involved in the day-to-day and empowering people to be able to take on maybe stories or features in its entirety and try to accomplish them, even if it takes them longer than it would typically take someone else. A lot of ownership is important in terms of team management, because at the end of the day, the long-term effects of that is that you have a lot more leaders down the line. Immediately, it may look like, so it's not particularly helpful in the startup situation, but when you have a fairly established product, it's helpful to encourage people to take ownership of features and develop them through. And so that's the approach that I utilize a lot with. But in the distributed team, where I've worked with teams where some are in India, some are in Dallas, some are in London, one of the things that are key in that is communication. Sorry. One of the things that are key in that is communication.
I'm sorry. It was a question that somebody asked.
One of the key things in distributed teams is communication, because you have people waking up at different time zones. So if you had a team in India working on the API and the team in Dallas working on the client side, they have to have communication in really well, in a sense where, for instance, the API should clearly communicate what the endpoints are going to look like, such that the client team can work on that seamlessly. Even if there's a problem with the endpoint, they can still continue with, for instance, mock data and validate it against that, so that whenever it's all integrated, it comes together smoothly. I think communication in that sense, and understanding a lot of standardized ways of doing things. For instance, documentation would be key in terms of managing teams, because people have come in with different experiences and different ideas of how things are done. And if that's not streamlined and made into the standardized way of doing things, it very easily becomes a difficult, chaotic thing to manage. How does Ghana tech scene stack up against Dallas? It's like comparing Ghana jollof to Nigeria's. um, um, for all of you that may not know, Nigerian jollof doesn't really taste good. It's a type of dish that is it's like rice that is colored with yellow. It's colored with tomato-based stew, so it has this orange color. Anyway, um, that doesn't compare at all altogether. Dallas's tech startup and Ghana's tech startup. Dallas's tech startup culture is pretty heavy, where there's a lot of different clusters of startups in different sections of Dallas, and Ghana actually is pretty up and coming relative to the West African region. And then there's a lot of opportunity, and there's a lot more opportunity for tech startups in Ghana. So you find that there's a lot more available in Ghana, even though there's a lot more funding available in Dallas. But there's a lot more opportunity just by virtue of Ghana being a third world and an African climate, where there's a lot more opportunity for technology progress and advancement. In a single developer startup, is there a way to have someone review your code and or design? Are there risks involved in having a third party do this? That is a good question. I'm not familiar with a third party's system to do this. And I don't particularly think there'll be a risk with it if there's an actual organization set up to do this, where you've presumably signed the right agreements with them to be able to do that for you. But I'm not particularly familiar with that.
You sparked up a heated debate there.
Yeah, I didn't realize. I'm glad people are familiar with Ghana jollof, and I don't even know. I've never had Nigerian jollof, honestly, so I can never speak about it. But I've seen it, and sometimes seeing is believing.
Is there a place in Dallas that you would recommend getting Ghanaian jollof or jollof in general?
Sadly, no.
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 Oh, we've got some people in the chat. Timmy's Kitchen.
What kind? Wait.
What kind of arguments can you think of for a third party? And then time check, we have about 5 minutes. What kind of agreements can you think of for?
Essentially, I think the person already answered it themselves. SC, pretty much, yeah, NDA or yeah, essentially, pretty much an NDA. But if it's a third-party organization that is already it's providing that service, I'm presuming that will be part of whatever they write. Else, nobody would be comfortable with having their code reviewed.
Perfect. We've got people volunteering to cook at their parents' house.
Yeah, that's the only way you can get Ghanaian food. but the parents have to be first immigrant Ghanaians, first generation. What's some of the major challenges you've had with managing remote teams? So, like I mentioned earlier, communication is a major thing that needs to be. So, there's a lot of effort and time that needs to be put into communication and documentation. Without communication and documentation and processes, it's very difficult to account for work being done, and there's a lot of wasted time in terms of work being done. So I may be up in Ghana trying to finish up some code, and then I would speak to a Dallas team, and it's not what we're meant to do, because we had a conversation, but it was never documented, and that could be a whole day wasted of just development. Or yeah, so communication and documentation and just processes. How do we go about things, and document and all that? That's really, if you can get that right, it just takes a lot of time to write that out and think that out. But if you can get it initially, it serves you well down the line.
Yeah, especially for small companies. Oh, a lot of feedback. Especially for small companies, probably oversharing on Slack or Microsoft Teams or Discord or whatever you're using would probably be a good route to go.
Is
Right.
Ghana set up to scale as a valid outsource hub? If not, what's the pipeline needed? It is set up to scale as a valid outsource hub for the Western or the North American market. One, because um, of the language barrier. There is not much, because English is the official language for one, and then secondly, the infrastructure is already in place in terms of internet and just technology in general in terms of supporting that. And then thirdly, internally, there are a good number of universities that push out good university candidates for, I guess, developmental work. And then fourthly, and lastly, um, the cost is not as ridiculous in terms of FTEs, in terms of having people work on development work for you.
What about time difference? Is that
time difference? It's on the same time as London for the GMT. So it's not too far of a stretch. For instance, it's 10 o'clock, 10:30 in Dallas. It's 3:30 in the afternoon in Ghana right now. So it's sometimes a 6 hour, sometimes a 5 hour difference, depending on daylight savings. And so it's not too much of a difference. It all works within the reasonable time frame.
awesome? I think we have time for one quick answer to a question. So you can pick whichever question that is left.
Where did I even start? Excuse me. Jim, I don't think we've had anything from Jim.
Yeah.
How do coding school grads compare to CS grads? Hmm. um, so coding school on its own makes you great at pushing out code, right? If you don't add on to that, you may just get stuck at just being able to push out code. So you may never ever progress to an architect or senior role. What I think computer science gives you is a lot of theory and fundamentals and architectural point of view of thinking through database design and efficient design and stuff like that. So when you combine the two, you can start thinking on a high level how to approach a problem and how to solution for things. But not to say that it's directly correlated to code in school or the CS. It's also correlated to the individual. If the individual is motivated to just do beyond um, pushing out code and thinking out solutions, because a lot of us now today, for basic day-to-day solutions, we can Google it and then just tweak it a little bit. But when it comes to problems where you're facing where it has never been solution, and you have to essentially be that person that would ever put it out on Google, it helps to understand infrastructure, architecture a little more deeper.
Oh, cool. Actually, I was just writing. I was going to go ahead and like let this chat continue. I see that there's still quite a few questions, and Ciprin being gracious enough to answer them. If that's fine with you, Ciprin, I'll kind of like let this continue to go. I will be heading out. Going to get the next session prepped and ready. Ciprin, thank you again for taking the time to enlighten us with your wisdom. Again, thank you, CodeUp, for sponsoring the coding track, and everybody who's here watching. Ciprin, back to you.
All right, thank you. Okay, so I will just move down the line until we ran out of questions. How's dealing with the time zone different? So for me, honestly, everything around me, my computer, my phones, still stick with the time zones that are important for me. So Dallas is predominantly the most important time zone for me right now. So I always reference that in terms of working. So that's the only way I work around it. So I just stay indoors. I'm used to being indoors for the most part, and I just work and just forget about whether it's day or afternoon outside, and just stick to my time zones based on my computer. So right now it's about to be lunchtime. So any tips for maintaining code standards and quality in a startup with junior to mid development? Yeah, that in a startup specifically, I mean, peer review is always a good thing, but like I said, you need to have things well documented initially so that they just know some of the standards to follow in the first place. But including peer review of the code that they commit into the branch also helps a lot, because then it's kind of like if you walking through, okay, I wrote this and I need you to rewrite it this way. It's a little easier for a lot of people to learn that way, as opposed to just theorizing about what's the best way to approach something. And thirdly, if the team is also remote or distributed, or even if not, if you're in the same space, it helps to do peer programming, where you sit with each other, or you share a screen and you peer program every now and then, just kind of see the thinking process, not only from the junior developer, so that they can also see the thinking process of the senior developer, and then start to understand the idea behind design. And particularly, another approach is with bugs. Thinking processes with solving for bugs helps down the line in terms of solutioning for new features, because you start to think about all the edge cases fairly easily. What is the most widely used tool that startups use for data visualization? I don't think I know the statistics on that. I think I'll probably do a Google search to probably find that out. I don't think it's something that I would know off the top of my head. In terms of a startup tech team, who is your first hire, and what's the personality trait they should have? That's a good question. It depends on who you are yourself in the startup team. Are you the developer, or are you the brainchild behind the idea? Like, it really depends on who you are in the first place, and then you just need the next critical person. So if you are the brainchild, then and it's an app, for instance, you're building, you need maybe a co-founder that also can understand clearly your vision, but also has a technical background probably. But if you're the technical person and you're not particularly great beyond that, then you would also need someone else that complements you well in that. So it really, the first question is, who are you? Who are you? And then beyond that, find the right complement that's needed. And absolutely, yeah, they should fit. They should fit the culture that is the culture you're creating. But you have to be able to define that so that when you have that shared vision, you can define that together. But culture is also fluid and changes over time as well. And I think you should probably accommodate and allow for that as a startup. No problem, guys. Thank you. Okay, if there aren't any questions anymore, I would go ahead and end the session. All right. Thank you guys again.